Hello and welcome to Superpower Broadcasting. I'm Kevin Castley. Thanks for being here tonight. Tonight we are live with Jaeger DePato, and we are going to be discussing the recent formal normalization of relations between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. Now, this is the sort of thing that it was kind of obvious for a long time that a lot of the Gulf states, including, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, had been cooperative with Israel and at least not antagonistic towards Israel for a long time, even though formally there were hostile relations. However, this is a formal recognition of essentially amicable ties with Israel now. That is still, it's quite remarkable considering the fact that we're talking about the Middle East. We're talking about a region in which all of these states decades ago, back in the 70s, had embargoed the United States of America simply for recognizing Israel. And they had blockaded and cut off the United States from oil access, at least from their ports. And now we are in such a world. We've come so far that these same states are not only friendly and loyal to the United States and United States interests, but actually Israel and Israeli interests, that they're not mutually exclusive, that you can be a Gulf state and you can also be Israel and you can actually work together because, of course, there's a common enemy here. And we'll get to that in the stream once we, we introduce Jaeger and everything, which is that the menace is Iran. Iran is gearing up to have nuclear weapons aimed at these countries. And the window, as I said in last night's stream, the window to act to stop Iran is closing. And so it brings together countries that might not see eye to eye all the time, but this is a positive piece of news. We've had a lot of bad news lately. I think that this is a really good bit of information to come out of the world recently. And I find it interesting how, for us who are the war hawks, the neocon ghouls, whatever label you want to apply to us, right? Our community was largely happy with this. Now, there are some caveats and everything, but largely happy with this. But the so-called peace nicks, the so-called anti-war crowd, the so-called anti-military industrial complex crowd, the hippies, those kinds of people, they're furious that we've got peace between the UAE and Israel. They're outraged. We'll talk about the hashtags and the drama a little bit later in the stream. But, just before we go to Jaeger, I just wanted to state for the record here, isn't it kind of funny how they portray us as bloodthirsty warmongers and everything? But when there is, a real meaningful peace that can come about, we're supportive of it. And they're angry. Now, why are they angry? They're supposed to be pro-peace. No, they're just anti-America. They're on the side of Iran. They're upset because this hurts Iran. They don't actually care about peace. So there we go. So that's my thoughts on this. We got a few people in the chat right now, and but we're going to go to Jaeger first. So how are you, Jaeger?
I'm doing well. It's always a pleasure to come on, so thanks for having me.
Oh yeah, no, anytime. Like I said, I appreciate your perspective. I mean, like for example, we did our discussion on the situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and you're one of the more knowledgeable people on YouTube on this. By the way, everybody, what are you doing? You gotta go and subscribe to Jaeger DePato over on YouTube. Let's get his channel up to 100 subs. Let's go. So,
Cool. Thank you for the plug. So just to kind of just go over this agreement briefly. So the agreement was for the UAE and Israel to, come to diplomatic relations, and for Israel to stop the annexation of the West Bank and stop their activities is kind of where the agreement was. And it's a historic agreement because they didn't have any diplomatic ties before. And this just came out right out of the blue. Like nobody was talking about, and all of a sudden there's a peace deal. And it appears that it was brokered by the United States and the Donald Trump administration, which is interesting to say the least.
Well, See, we got Jay here in the chat, and he's not a fan of the deal. He says that it's going to be a bad deal for Israel, and we can actually bring him on to give his perspective on this. I think it'd be interesting. But for me, I will say, I I don't really like the aspect of it as it relates to the West Bank per se. I've said before, I'm like, if it's going to be the Palestinian Authority and Hamas versus Israel, I think that Israel should just control the entire area. But if it were ever possible that you could have a democratic government that was free and fair elections and everything in Palestine, I'm okay with a two-state solution. I just don't want to give that area over to terrorists and legitimize that. That's kind of my view here. But I understand that in order to get a broader and more lasting cooperation between the Gulf states and Israel, you do have to make some concessions there. And I think that the issue with Iran is it poses such an existential threat to Israel that you basically do need to work closer with the Gulf states here, because an all-out war with Iran is going to require working with the Gulf states too to take them out. So that's kind of my perspective on it. But I can send Jay the invite though, because I think it would be interesting to get his perspective on that. But what are your thoughts?
It's interesting from like the Israeli perspective. So they're going to suspend the annexation, not totally eliminate it. So it's just going to be suspended. And there are things going on with Israel with the coronavirus that it would make sense for them to kind of stop the annexation right now during the pandemic. But the opportunity for them to get diplomatic relations with their ultimate enemy in the area, which is Iran, who's arming Hamas, who's arming Hezbollah, to get another ally on their side, because the Emirates hate Iran as well, and Qatar. And so they have that little beef going on as well. But I just see it, they can potentially get some influence on the Emirates and improve, or through soft power, that state domestically.
Yeah. Well, Qatar, that's interesting. We got fresh news in the chat. He says here Qatar is the only Gulf state that has the money to stop Israel. Qatari-Iranian alliance is bad for the Middle East. I totally agree with that, but I think if it comes down to it, and you've got Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United States, UAE, and some associated states there against Iran and Qatar, even if Iran does manage to get nukes, it's not going to work out for Tehran and Doha in that example. I mean, they're just, I get, Qatar has a lot more power and influence economically. I understand that, but it's still nothing compared to Saudi Arabia. But they do have a good media outlet. I mean, obviously they fund Al Jazeera, they fund the Young Turks. I mean, like, Qatar's got their hands everywhere in the world media. So,
Well, yeah, and they've done their best to try to make enemies through their state-run media, but we still have a military base in their country. So there's only so far they can go, because we're inside their country already, and all their enemies around them don't like them. So Saudi Arabia doesn't like them. The Emirates don't like them. Bahrain tolerates them. Kuwait kind of tolerates them as well. So they're surrounded by enemies, and there's an ocean between them and their ally, Iran, and we control the Navy there.
Yes. You know what it reminds me of in a way? It's such a goofy alliance. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of back during the height of the Cold War, when you had the Soviet bloc like the Sino-Soviet split in the 50s and 60s, where China and the Soviet Union broke up and they hated each other and they were pointing nukes at each other. And Enver Hoxha of Albania aligned himself with Mao. So the only two pro-Maoist countries were China and Albania, and the Soviet bloc had nukes and tanks aimed at both. And you're like, okay, that's kind of weird. Your closest ally is 6,000 kilometers away. So that's not really going to work out. They're their only ally. That's kind of weird. So what did Hoxha wind up doing? Hoxha wound up building 750,000 bunkers across Albania, a country at the time of a couple million people. So it's like one bunker for every 3 people, because he expected a total invasion and nuclear war with the Soviets in Yugoslavia and the rest of the Warsaw Pact to shut down Chinese communism in Albania. And you're like, this is so weird. But this whole thing with Qatar, and which had good relations with the West, had good relations with a lot of the region. Now is, over the last decade and everything, but especially in recent years, aligning itself with Tehran, it's pretty goofy. It's pretty goofy, because if I'm the king of Qatar, I'm gonna want to be closer with Saudi Arabia and the United States than I am with Iran. It's weird. It's surreal to me, But maybe you could comment a little bit more on that, about, like, I guess, a bit of the background and everything on how that kind of animosity between Qatar and the rest of their neighbors came about.
Yeah, I think most of it started with the Arab Spring in 2011. So Al Jazeera, that's how their claim to fame, as they started covering this, where workers or regular people from all these different Arab countries started to rise up against their authoritarian governments. It resulted in a couple civil wars. You had one in Syria, one in Yemen. But because of that coverage, some of the monarchs were worried that they were going to be overthrown. So, like the Saudi monarch, the Emirates, they were worried their government was going to be overthrown, and thus they kicked the media out of their country so they could maintain that. And so then slowly after that, it sort of devolved, and there's even talks of Saudi Arabia building a canal, essentially turning Qatar into an island because their relations are so poor.
Well, Saudi Arabia could actually fund that. They do, even though there's talk about them going bankrupt and everything. They could actually fund that. That could actually happen. I mean, that'd be an interesting situation. Just like, hi, you're an island now. What now?
Yeah. Then there's the Yemen Civil War too, kind of split them up as well, because you have the Houthis that were backed by Qatar and Iran, and then you had the Houthis, which were originally backed by the Emirates. There's some infighting there now, some southern separatists that support the Emirates versus the Saudis. But you had the Saudi coalition, which Qatar was not a part of at the beginning. And so there's animosity there as well. And so Qatar's kind of in its own little island, but it's still doing well as far as oil, as far as media. But yeah, they've kind of pissed off all their neighbors.
Yeah. I don't think it would work out very well for them. Their military and everything. I mean, going up against Saudi Arabia, one of the largest militaries in the world, it would not work out. Even if they got Iran on their side, as you point out, of course, United States controls the Persian Gulf. United States actually has a base in their own territory. So, and of course, the United States is close with Saudi Arabia. So.
Yeah, we have multiple bases in that area. All of them. In Bahrain, Kuwait, a bunch in Saudi, Iraq. The United States is pretty military strong in that area. And Qatar really doesn't do as much militarily as some of the other states. And so they're kind of weak on that front. They would be more reliant on Iranian support.
Yeah, they strike me as kind of, if you're playing Civilization or whatever, you're like the kind of player who you see your opponents and stuff building up, all these military units and everything, and you're kind of like, but I just need to finish my grain silos, bro. You're only focused on your economic infrastructure. It's like, oh, but if they cross over the border, none of that matters. Now you're their territory. It's like you have to do something on the military angle. Especially, I don't know, it's just they're almost kind of like a city state. They're a pretty small country, and I don't know, it just seems like they're in for some trouble if they're going to go down this route further. Because I mean, you point out the coverage and everything during the Arab Spring of that really kind of pissed off a lot of their neighbors and everything. But I mean, the Qatari system, they're not like the good guys here. They're not like some benevolent democratic leaders. They're an absolute monarchy, just like Saudi Arabia is. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the way it is kind of in the Middle East and a lot of countries, but it's generally not great to make enemies with everybody who lives around you. as far as
Yep.
like a foreign policy. And so it'll be interesting to see that forward because they don't like Israel as well. And then of course, you have Lebanon with Hezbollah. They don't like Israel. Hamas there in Palestine. And then the Assad government also. Syrians and Israelis have always had bad relations. So it's good for Israel to get this next step. I think we saw Bahrain also supported the agreement. Oman, which is kind of like the Switzerland of the area, they want to stay out of most conflicts and kind of be friends with everybody. But Egypt already has good relations. Azerbaijan, Armenia have good relations with Israel. Like, the one that really surprised me was Turkey coming out against this agreement.
Yeah, they were salty, man.
And I think that may have to do with their conflict in Libya. But still, like that kind of surprised me a little bit that Turkey would be against it.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. And there are a lot of people who are supporting Turkey right now. I mean, we got people on Twitter unironically supporting Turkey, the Muslim Brotherhood, a lot of brainlet brigades out there. And I guess, I do want to bring up something that's been trending on Twitter today and in the last couple of days in the wake of the announcement of the formal normalization of relations between the UAE and Israel. And that's hashtag UAE backstabs, or no, it was hashtag UAE stabs Muslims. That's the hashtag that the brainlet brigades are going with because they're upset that the UAE and Israel are formally talking.
Well, I mean, pick a country in the Middle East and you could pick them backstabbing Muslims. All, I mean, all of them except for Israel are really authoritarian. And so, like, you could pick any one of those countries and say, well, they're backstabbing Muslims, but this is just the people that support Hamas, that support Hezbollah, and support Iran. Saying,
and they don't mean backstab in the same way that you're referring to there, of like oppressing your own people who happen to be Muslim. They mean they're backstabbing. They mean that they're backstabbing Muslims by talking with the Jews. That's what they mean. Spooky.
Yeah, there's always been like kind of that battle, and even like I said before this event, UAE and Israel didn't have relations. Like this event's getting them to have relations. And my hope is that Israel has an effect on them, similar to the way that the United States is kind of moving Saudi Arabia in a better direction through soft power rather than, hard power. And they can move them domestically into a better spot than what they are currently.
Well, that'd be the hope. Like I was saying before we went live tonight, how that dynamic only really goes in Israel's favor because there's no way that the UAE is going to use their soft power to turn Israel towards a Sharia state. It's not going to happen. But the Israeli way of life looks pretty appealing, especially if you're already middle class or something in the UAE and you want more freedom. It always works in favor of democracies and secular systems. So.
Yeah, and I think if we could build like the Middle Eastern countries, they can build a middle class. I think it'll go a long way for them changing domestically.
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting turn of events. But what do you think of that trade-off though, altogether when it comes to the West Bank? Because Jay's not too happy about it, but he said that he can't come on here right now because he doesn't he's not actually at his place right now. So
well, I think Israel is going to suspend operations because of COVID anyway. And so since they're going to do it anyway, why not just bring in UAE and Trump? It's going to be politically advantageous for all three governments to sign this deal, especially during the pandemic, for something that Israel was going to do anyway.
Right. No, that's a good point. You may as well take a win, on the side as well. But what do you think, though, of the idea that this is going to help Trump domestically? Because people were saying how he needed some sort of foreign policy victory in the wake of the debacle with Kim and how the North Koreans are, as we all knew would happen, they're not respecting Trump's wishes. So he needed something. And, Trump's going to try to brand this as a win for him and everything. What do you think about that? Do you think that it will help Trump much at this point? Because he is down big time compared to Joe Biden right now. So, but we're still a few months out.
Yeah, I think it's a win, and I think it's also a distraction from, I think China's arming Iran as well, going past that blockade and arming Iran anyway. And so it's kind of a distraction from Iran getting more arms, but it's also a win for him. Trump's been probably the most pro-Israel president we've had in the last little while. And in some cases, it allows Israel to do a little bit more than what they normally do. But it's a big win for Trump in this front, but I don't know if it's going to be enough to overcome the deficit he currently has.
Yeah. Well, just on the side, I think it's an important note there that Trump, that is true. He has been one of the most pro-Israel presidents. And that's something that, some of his griper type supporters are just, they've been fuming about that for years, because their whole thing is that, they want to brand themselves like Nick Fuentes does with Trump's slogans of like America first and everything. But they can't stand the fact that he's close to Israel. They hate it. And it's always funny to me when you've got the people like on the far left that will constantly call Trump like a fascist or even a Nazi. And it's like, yeah, but I mean, I'm not that much a fan of Trump, but you can't really say he's been anti-Israeli or anything. He's actually been very friendly towards Israel. So
yeah, and probably a way he's getting played a little bit by Netanyahu too.
Well, I mean, Netanyahu's actually smart, so it makes sense. So,
well, I mean, Trump gets played by Kim, he gets played by Turkey, he gets played by everybody who says nice things to him. All you have to do is just praise him, and then he'll let you do whatever you want.
No, I know. It's like, imagine Trump's president and you're just the leader of whatever country. It doesn't have to be an ally. It could be like the worst enemy of America. All you have to say is that his hotel rooms had the softest towels, and he will bend arm and leg backwards for you on the world stage and talk about how you should be in the G8. Like let's say you're like the leader of, I don't know, Eritrea. You're just the dictator of Eritrea and Trump's president. And you call him up and you're like, yo, your hotels, man, they're swaggy. And he's like, Eritrea should be in the G8. It's like, what?
Yeah, I mean, and I think domestically there's a big opportunity for Democrats rather than fighting him. All you have to do is just say something nice to him and he'll do what you want. Like, rather than creating this battle, like as we've seen some places where, like North Korea, where Kim Jong was nice to him, and all of a sudden he's writing love letters. Like, I think domestically, I think the strategy was a little bit wrong, because all you have to do is just praise him and hop him up, and he'll go to bat for you. But if you go against him,
that's what's so funny. That's so funny. I guess this is a bit of a little sidetrack here, but I think it's worth discussing now that you bring it up. Imagine the Democrats hadn't taken this whole campaign of Trump is literally Hitler. Trump is terrible. We can never agree with Trump on anything. If Trump does anything that we agree with, we have to change our position lest we agree with the orange man who we're calling a fascist and a racist and everything. Imagine if they hadn't gone so hard on the attack and didn't have so much pride as they do, that they were able to, once he wins, say, okay, we lost, fair game, right? But, you have some nice towels in your hotel rooms and you had the best deals. You could get so much done. Like, it would almost be like the Democrats were in charge, because it would be so easy to play him. But they're too stubborn, and they're too dug in to this Trump derangement syndrome thing, that they would sooner literally change their own platform to spite Trump than they would try the Kim tactic, where you just say that, like, oh, dude, you're big, and then he does everything for you, because it's so easy to play him. You literally just say, like, dude, your towels are soft, and he would give you your tax proposal or whatever. So,
yeah, and I think there's, on the foreign policy level, there's a bunch of countries I think could have been better by going that approach as well, because he's very divisive, but he's also very agreeable at the same time, as long as you don't come out very combative. If you come combative, he's
Yeah.
gonna come right back as hard as he can. But if you say something nice to him and then approach the conversation that way, he'll say yes to whatever you want because you're being
No,
nice to him.
that's such a good point, because for all this talk of him and all this branding of him as like, this fearless lion and everything, no, he's very high on the agreeable score. You could say something that he was disagreeing with 30 seconds ago, but you tell him like, hey man, you've got the best deals and everything. He'll do whatever you want. Like it's so obvious. He's a very easily swayed person. So,
Yeah, and I imagine in this case, Israel came up to him and said, "Hey, we're going to stop things in the West Bank. Can you get one of the other Arab countries to come together and we can make some sort of deal for diplomatic relations?" And Trump's like, "Yeah, I'll do that." Netanyahu, you're a very good man. You said
yeah,
nice
I
things
bet
about me
Netanyahu.
before.
I bet Netanyahu called him up and said like, "Oh man, this will be the best deal, the greatest deal. It'll be your deal. It'll be the art of the deal." And Trump was like, "Oh, I like deals."
Yeah. And fortunately for us, this one I believe worked out for the better. This deal it's great just getting diplomatic relations, like a diplomatic first step between two countries who have been both friendly to the United States and both supported different interventions in the United States, and getting those on the same side, so then they have these relations. So in the future, if there's another event, that they can be on the same side, they can work together. Even
Yeah,
though
well,
they're
it's such a good point, because you brought up earlier on as we were talking, you mentioned how this was, the trade-off sort of thing was going to happen no matter what. It was almost like the Cuban Missile Crisis thing, where you can say, well, the U.S. took missiles out of Turkey and Italy, but then you're like, yeah, but those were slated for decommissioning anyway. So it's kind of, it was kind of going to happen, as you mentioned, due to the pandemic, but you might as well score a diplomatic victory on top of it. So I think to Jay's point earlier on that this was bad for Israel, in the context of them going in this direction no matter what, it's objectively better that you have the UAE talking with you now, because it also means that in the UN and all these other things, and I can talk about how like the UN should be irrelevant and whatnot, but it still carries weight with people's opinions. It means that the UAE is less likely going to be condemning Israel every time on these UN panels and stuff, right? So
yeah, they get some political support. Like from the Israeli perspective, it's something you're going to do anyway, and then you're going to get more international support, more regional support in the area, and you may be able to work out some arms deals also to the Emirates, who are currently in Yemen as well. So it may economically work out for Israel as well. And so there's a lot to like from the Israeli perspective, and from the Emirate perspective. You could get weapons, you piss off Iran, which is
yes.
One of their foreign policy goals at this point is just to piss off Iran.
Oh, they succeeded big time on that. I mean, look at the Brainlet Brigades on Twitter. UAE stabs Muslims. Oh man, I love it. I love it. It's so good, because the thing is, this was a win-win-win. It was good for US, it was good for Israel, it was good for the UAE. The only people who lost big were your enemies. That's the best deal. So,
Yeah, it's a great deal all around. And it also helps UAE in the aspect, like if they get attacked, well, now they have diplomatic relations with Israel, and they have a supply to weapons, or even Mossad as well. And so Iran's pissed because Mossad now, other than Azerbaijan, has a southern region where they can attack Iran as well, potentially.
yeah.
Like they still have to do more talks and stuff like that. This is just an opening of diplomatic relations, but Israel's strategically placing themselves against Iran. Now you have to get Iran to stop building weapons and stop getting weapons, which is going to be a difficult task, but it does put them in a better position than what they were yesterday or the day before the deal.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on the next question, though, which is, do you see this expanding in the region? Do you see a similar sort of thing happening with Saudi Arabia and perhaps even, maybe Kuwait as well?
I do see Kuwait and I do see Saudi Arabia eventually doing the same type of thing. Now, it may not be, it has to be like a mutual beneficial thing. They're not going to make a deal just to make a deal, but there could be something like an arms deal where they open up diplomatic relations. So Saudi now gets some arms from Israel. Kuwait, I see, think is more, it's a small country wedged in between Iraq, which has a lot of instability right now, and Iran. Like there's a United States air base there, but it wouldn't be in their worst interest to have relations with Israel as well. So
Yeah.
Bahrain's on board. Oman, like I said, they're trying to be friends with everybody. And so they would probably be for or against it just to try to maintain diplomatic ties with everybody. But yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
but now Hamas doesn't like it. Palestinians don't like it. So there's two groups in Palestine. There's Hamas and then there's the Palestinians. Hamas is the worst out of the two. Palestinians are more reasonable on that aspect. But yeah, Hamas hates it. Hezbollah hates it. Lebanon is still going through their kind of domestic issues right now, but I imagine they wouldn't like it. And it's probably going to be shortly where we're going to hear Syria not like it as well, depending on what Putin allows Assad to say.
Yeah. Well, I want to address Dr. Zayas' question in the chat because he says, what genre of idiot is posting hashtag UAE stabs Muslims in the back? Well, the actual full hashtag is hashtag UAE stabs Muslims. It's, according to this guy Zaidu on Twitter, who's got 5,500 likes here, he says, well done, Pakistanis, for trending hashtag UAE stabs Muslims. Let's bring back 1.5 million Pakistan citizens from UAE. Also, let's return their $35 billion loans by selling our kidneys, eyes, which will cost approximately $40 billion in the international market. Extra $5 billion we'll use to buy Birani for our brave Pakistan army. So I was looking through a lot of the people posting. It's almost all people in Pakistan, and there's a couple like white SJWs, and that's it. So, it seems like it was a thing orchestrated largely out of Pakistan. And also some people have some Iran flags in their bios too. So there's that. And Turkey, some Turkish flags too. So they're salty.
Yeah. Pakistan will be the last country to recognize Israel.
Yeah, they literally forbid it on their passports. They're like, this passport is not good in Israel. Like, what a salty kind of thing to have on your passport, man. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
And of course, some of them are posting pictures of their passports right now to like drive the point home that like Pakistan is like the true home of what Islam or whatever, I guess. That like the UAE and Saudi Arabia are sellouts, that kind of idea.
Yeah, I don't know if Pakistan has a good relation with Saudi Arabia. I think they just don't like the UAE for making this deal. If Saudi makes that deal, it throws an interesting dynamic in there because Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have really good relations. And
Yeah.
so that may be one of the barriers for Saudi Arabia to go into a similar deal as their relationship with Pakistan.
Yeah, I'm just like looking at some of the posts here where they're like stomping on flags of the UAE. We got this one guy here who says UAE sided with the oppressors that have occupied Palestine. UAE has not only betrayed Palestine, but it betrayed the whole of Muslim Ummah. And then they got the hashtag. We got some people here saying, they're basically tweeting support for Erdogan. People calling Israel a terrorist state. We got people down here. I'm not sure where this poster's from. Oh, there we go. Another Pakistani. Yeah, a lot of it is out of Pakistan, and then of course we got people posting their passports to like say how like Israel sucks and and they're also trying to own the UAE right now by posting pictures of the Burj Al Khalifa, like the tallest building in the world, with the Israeli flag on it, basically to I guess try to own them by like implying that they're like an Israeli puppet now and all this kind of stuff, which is funny because it's like Israel and the UAE did have some discussions. They did have informal relations. They did cooperate on some intelligence affairs before. This is just a formal beginning of, transparent relations. So nothing really has changed too much apart from the formality of it. Uh, and of course, Israel in terms of their stance on the West Bank and everything. But it's like it's kind of funny to me. It's kind of funny to see how, I mean, it's just this whole situation is just it's hilarious because Israel has every right to exist. Like because the end game of every one of these brainlets posting this right now is that Palestine or whatever should occupy Israel. That would be an outcome that they would see nothing wrong with. So they're praising what's his name, Erdogan and whatnot.
Yeah. So what Turkey said was they will not never forget or forgive this hypocritical behavior of the UAE in agreeing to deal with normalization of relations with Israel, which is extremely hypocritical of Turkey because they were the first country to normalize relations with
Yes,
Israel.
yes, they literally did. They literally did. That is correct. That's correct. Oh man, yeah, it's kind of surreal. The times change, right? So, I mean, the world could be a very different place even in 10 years. Who knows, right? Maybe it'd be Pakistan. Well, it wouldn't be Pakistan, but like could be something crazy. Maybe Israel and, well, maybe Israel and Iran will have good relations in 10 years. I mean, let's say that Iran gets liberated a year from now, total war, no more nuclear program and everything. They get a democracy going. Now they have ties with Israel. So that could happen too. So
Yeah, I find it really interesting because I've covered Azerbaijan and Armenia. Azerbaijan is one of Israel's strongest allies in the region, and they're Turkey's little brother, which
yeah.
Azerbaijan hasn't said anything about it. And so it's really interesting, like how Turkey can take that stance. Like, and I don't get it unless it has to do with Libya, because the Emirates will be on the other side of the Turks in Libya. Like, there's
Yeah.
no other reason because Turks really don't support the Syrians. I mean, they genocide the Syrians too. So,
No, they literally did. They gave their pretext for going in that they were stopping Bashar the Butcher's genocide, and then they went in and proceeded to butcher the northern part of Syria. So and the Kurds. So
yeah. So there's,
Trump, by the way, for everybody who might be thinking, well, oh, well, this is a foreign policy victory for Trump. Let's keep it real. Trump backstabbed the Kurds. All of this pales in comparison to his colossal fuck up by giving that part of the world over to Turkey. Oh man, dude, imagine unironically thinking that Turkey's our friend in 2020. Like, it's not the Cold War anymore. Like, don't get me wrong, we're still in another Cold War with Russia, but it's not the old Cold War. Turkey's on their side now. It's not like back in the day where they were useful against the Soviets. They're with the Kremlin. They turned down F-35 so they could buy Russian swag. It's pathetic. So
yeah, and we're halting arms deals with Turkey now. Finally, there's some action on that front
final.
for their actions on that front. But yeah, Turkey kind of is going to play the game. So, they have decent relations with Iran, but they don't like any of the Arabs. And so they, they're a very interesting country in this dynamic because if you wanted to cut Russia off, they would have to be your ally because you could blockade everything that Russia did in the Black Sea in Istanbul. And
Yeah, it's
so,
true.
but as far as Turkey's work in the Mediterranean now, and Libya is kind of a different case because they're technically on the side of the internationally recognized government, but
Yeah.
definitely their work in northern Iran and northern Syria should throw up a million red flags to kind of what they're doing because they're slowly taking territory moving south.
That's true. That's true. I think that, it's right to bring up some nuance there because obviously it's Cyprus, it's a shit show. They're the bad guys in Syria, they're the bad guys in the Middle East, they're the bad guys. But in Libya, I mean, they are helping against the Russians, they are helping against Haftar. So, they are the lesser evil in that specific environment, in my view. So, but I mean, we were talking about this on the recent stream. The last time you came on here, I believe we were talking about the Azerbaijan-Israeli relationship. It's it's interesting. How dynamic these sorts of things can be, and how it kind of shows that even a pretty staunchly Islamic sort of society and everything could still work with Israel, buy weapons from Israel, etc. And I think that the opportunity, if Saudi Arabia and Israel just outright formally become not even necessarily allies, but just decent trading partners, they could both win so big on that. So
Yeah, they could win bigly, but I just worry about
bigly.
the Pakistan element because Pakistan is prone to releasing terrorists into the world.
Oh yeah, they hid Bin Laden, and for
they
years.
they created the Taliban.
Yeah.
They them, and actually it was Saudi Arabia too. So kind of going back to their dynamic, Wahhabism and Saudi Arabia for a long while. They're slowly moving towards a better direction now, but for a long while they were the leading sponsor of world terrorism. Like even in Russia or Chechnya, that area, they sponsored some of that. They sponsored it, Al Qaeda, Taliban. Like Saudi Arabia was an awful player, but because of the soft power of the United States, they're slowly going through an evolution process, which goes to, if we could get soft power in some of these other countries where we don't necessarily have to go intervene, they can get better domestically.
Yeah, no, and that's true. And the thing is, it should be noted that in the context of the Saudi Arabian political spectrum, the royals, especially MBS, he's seen as like a decadent Western puppet. The Wahhabist clerics are not happy with the royals. They want more power. They want more influence. They want more theocratic overreach in Saudi Arabian economics and society and everything. And they're not happy with the direction that Saudi Arabia has been going down. And I'm happy with the direction that Saudi Arabia has been going. It's a slow process, but especially once Iran is liberated, you can really start applying leverage on Saudi Arabia to reform, right? It's like the Jeane Kirkpatrick idea that, yeah, you got to work with some bad actors, but that gives you leverage over them. And once the greater evil is dealt with, now you have a lot of leverage over them, and they've got a lot of incentive to reform, to stay in your good grace. So I think Saudi Arabia has a lot of potential to become, not necessarily like Israel or anything anytime soon, but definitely a lot more secular, a lot more Western, a lot more prosperous. And the Wahhabi clerics are going to be fuming and dooming every step of the way, talking about how the royals are going to burn in hell and everything and all this. So,
Yeah, it goes back to, kind of dangling the carrot. Saudi being with us, we can sell weapons, we can provide an ally against Iran. In order for the allyship to work, not necessarily as a consequence, they have to reform domestically. They have to get better because we are dangling that carrot in front of them and they want to eat the carrot rather than hitting them with a stick, which would be a bad idea since they already want to be allies with us. They already want to work with us. And so,
for sure. Like, you don't even want to use the stick with them. There's no point. Like, nobody's talking about an intervention against Saudi Arabia. I don't think they would ever come to that. I think that their leadership despite all the ramblings of some of the extreme fundamentalists in their country. The leadership want to be, they want to have a relationship with the West. So, and the West then gets soft power to influence Saudi society. And that's what's happening right now. And it might take 50 years, but like, let's keep it real right now. In 50 years, Saudi Arabia is going to look closer to Israel. I'll say that. Russia, if they continue on this trajectory, is going to look basically like North Korea. What are they doing? They're legalizing wife beating, whereas Saudi Arabia is legalizing women being able to drive. Like, they're moving in opposite directions. Russia right now, you could say, is more free if you're a woman. Yeah, but the direction that they're moving down, it's like Russia is going to become the new Saudi Arabia. Of what we used to think of as Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is going to look a lot more liberal in 50 years. I think a lot of the Gulf states are. And I think we're going to get to a point now where if this continues and these states normalize their relations with Israel, I think we're going to get to a point where there are going to be woke people in the European Union that are condemning Israel and calling to boycott Israel. And we're going to have Turkey and Iran constantly doing it. And they're going to be more anti-Israeli than the states that literally refused to sell America any oil and crashed the American economy basically in the 70s because the U.S. was supporting Israel. Like, it's going to be a 180, I think. And it's going to be interesting. I think it'll be a great time when Israel and the Gulf states are, formal partners against Iran. So,
yeah. And the most surprising thing about Iran is, despite like the sanctions, despite everything that goes on in that country, they're relatively decent at what they do. Like, it's actually very surprising with everything that goes on. They've actually been relatively decent. Like, if we could get a conversion, send some Mormon missionaries over there to convert them all to Christianity, or that's kind of a joke, but try to turn them. Like, they have a lot of potential, but they're just so engulfed in this government structure and this religious structure that they can't get over the top there. Because looking at Turkey, looking at Russia, Turkey's going to financially collapse here in the near future. Like, they're devaluing their currency and they're following the Argentina monetary philosophy. And Russia's economy is tanking as well.
Yep.
And so, like, they're going to come at a crossroads where they're going to have to do something different than what they're doing. But that really hasn't happened in Iran for, we haven't had diplomatic relations since, we had the Iran deal, but since like the 70s, since the clerics took over. And
but Iran back before the clerics took over was a pretty progressive place to live. It was a pretty cosmopolitan place to live, and they were pretty prosperous in many ways under the Shah. And they had, obviously good relations with America and everything against the Soviet Union. And now it's a nightmare. But the Iranian people, once they're liberated from this theocratic regime, they're going to be kicking ass again. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something to look forward in the Middle East. I mean, it goes back to what Christopher Hitchens said about kind of religion, is they're all totalitarianism. But when they run the country, like, it's a lot different than whether it's like in the United States where you can be Catholic, you can be Baptist, you can be all these different things, but it's not necessarily running the government. There's influence on the government, but it's not running the government, because any religion is going to be a totalitarian regime if they're in power.
Well, that's basically it, right? I mean, and you of course have the freedom in a country like America to be religious or not be religious, whereas in Iran, I mean, they literally have police out in the streets that will enforce religious law upon people. So,
yeah, and that's the case in kind of a lot of Gulf states where Sharia law is something that's practiced. I want to say Pakistan, the Emirates are one, Saudi Arabia.
Yep.
They just need kind of a liberalization of just kind of the way that religion is implemented into their government, and being less authoritarian overall. Taking that example, like if Israel can use some of that soft power for the Emirates so they don't practice Sharia law as much as they do now, that would be a great win for everyone.
No, absolutely, for sure. And yeah, I'm just, I'm sick of the people who say, "Oh, you're against Iran, but what about Saudi though?" I even did a video on that. It's just such a brainlet talking point because it's like, what are you suggesting we go to war with Saudi Arabia? Because then if you flip it back around like that, they're like, "What about Iran?" Or they'll be like, "No." It's like, well, then what about Saudi Arabia? It's like that's why I called the video. I'm like, "What about Saudi though?"
Yeah. I mean, all you really have to say is we're using soft power on Saudi Arabia. Would you rather have us use hard power?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. There's at least the option. Like, I wish that you could do it both ways. I wish that Iran wanted to be close to the U.S. too, and you could exert soft power on both of them and not have to have a war. But that's not really the direction that the Ayatollah and the IRGC really want to go. So, I had some idiot today tried to tell me that I was bloodthirsty because I was calling out people who were against killing Soleimani. I'm like, so the guy kills hundreds of thousands of people. That's cool. But you killed a guy who killed hundreds of thousands of people, bloodthirsty. So I was like, oh man, I bet this guy thought that the true tragedy of World War II was that Hitler died before his time, you know?
Yeah, the Soleimani thing, like, yeah, that was a good move, but at the same time, there are consequences for that action just because of how popular he was. He was more popular in the government in Iran. So yeah, there are consequences for those actions, but it was definitely a good thing because he was, one of the more brilliant military tacticians in the Middle East. And taking that away from Iran, they've kind of had the worst 2020 out of almost any country because they lost that supreme kind of tactician, that military tactician, and they've been taking L's pretty much
Yes.
all year.
They've been taking fat L's and this hashtag and everything today, they're just salty. They're taking L's left and right. They're taking L's across the region. They're taking L's at home. They're taking L's in Iraq. They're taking L's in Yemen. They're taking L's in the Gulf. They're taking L's everywhere, man. So
Yeah. And so on that level, looking back at it, it was definitely a good move. But I understand the other side is how popular this guy was. But it was for the benefit of everybody that his life was ended on that day earlier this year.
oh yeah, no, absolutely, 100%, 100%. But we are coming up on the hour mark right now, and so I do want to open up to comments and questions in the chat. So if anybody's got any questions for us or for Jaeger specifically, feel free to ask them now. We'll get to those, and then we'll wrap things up. So we got fresh news here. He says, people that oppose war have no idea that war hawks believe in strategic wars. I doubt any war hawk wants to go to war with every country. Part of being a war hawk is about making alliances. Yeah, the idea is that none of us like war. We're just not children, and we recognize the world that was handed to us, and we want to make it a better place. And we don't want to stick our head in the sands and pretend that our enemies don't exist and that we can change the world by not intervening in it. So,
Yeah, and there's a process that you kind of go through too. It's not like, well, this person did something bad, all of a sudden we're going to bomb them. It's like, well, we're going to first try soft power. If that doesn't work, we're going to try hard power. Sanctions normally the first one we go to, and if that doesn't work and it's strategically advantageous for us, we'll go and remove that person, which has been less the case the last few years due to not wanting to have interventions, and they've relied more on the sanctions, but definitely like soft power is something that we try first, and if that doesn't work we go to a more harder stance. But
yeah,
there are some things that are really like unforgivable, like Russia's invasion, annexation of Crimea. That was initially sanctions because you took over a piece of a sovereign country by first sending insurgents in. So like, there is give and take, but generally we want to stick with, trying soft power, exhausting all avenues before we go to war.
yeah, Absolutely. And I believe that there are only two countries in the world that are actually going to require a war to deal with. And that, of course, is North Korea. There's no possibility ever to have soft power over them. They know 100% how the game is played. They understand if they give up their nukes, that they render themselves vulnerable. And the only way that you get any progress there requires them giving up their nukes. That's never going to happen. So that's going to require a nuclear war. And Iran probably won't require a nuclear war unless they get nukes. But those are the two countries that it's going to require kinetic action against. Everywhere else in the world, Russia, China, they can either be bankrupted against or very much put into a corner in which they have to accept some sort of concessions, because Russia is dwindling. Now they're becoming more belligerent, yes, but I still believe that you can bankrupt them. I don't believe that you require a war against them. I think it simply requires, drilling a lot more oil in the West, selling it to Europe to undercut Russia, and they'll go bankrupt. Likewise with China, you can cut them off by not buying their stuff. They'll go bankrupt. North Korea and Iran have already kind of cut themselves off from the world, and so they're not as dependent on us. They have a lot more political will to see through hard times and force it upon their people, and not have a revolution take hold. North Korea is obviously far more consolidated like that. Iran, even in Iran, there's still the chance of an uprising happening, but I mean, we've seen that happen a couple times already, and the West did nothing. So it's unlikely that that would ever actually change anything. I think it'll still require a military operation. And I would say, and even Henry said this in the past, Reese has said this, it's like, if they're about to get nukes and they're about to get nukes, yeah, a war, you have to do a war. Otherwise, you're an idiot. It's like, look at what happened with North Korea. So in my view, those are the only two countries in the world where a war is actually required to deal with.
So yeah, just to respond to a couple of the comments in the chat, there's actually a second functioning democracy now in the Middle East, and it's in Africa. It's Tunisia. They're working on getting a little bit more democratic, but it's a really good thing to see there on the Africa side of things what Tunisia is doing as far as becoming a democracy. And it would be good if they got a relationship with Israel as well. But yeah, it's slowly changing. We're seeing how the soft power is working with Saudi Arabia. It's a process. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. But yeah, the best functioning democracy in the Middle East is being circled by sharks.
Yeah. But I think I think we'll wrap this up now though, because I got to go to bed and everything. But I want to say thanks for coming on, Jaeger. And so, I'll give you the floor right now and make any sort of closing remarks if you got any. So.
Yeah. So with this deal, it is beneficial for Israel. In my opinion, it was something they were going to do anyway due to the coronavirus, is not try to annex anymore, try to make peace. There's the thing that happened in Beirut. They don't want to piss off Lebanon to create another war on that side. So doing this, but also having the opportunity to normalize relations with UAE is a gold mine, and it's something that's politically advantageous for the United States because they brokered the deal, but also Israel and also UAE. UAE's doing this because they can get weapons from Israel, they can get an economic boost from having relations with Israel, and it helps them in their fight against Iran, which is becoming more and more of an enemy to the country. Now we can hope going forward that UAE, which domestically is an awful place, can go the route of kind of Saudi Arabia, start to improve things domestically for the people, build a middle class, and then eventually get and implement a democracy. So I see it as something that's very positive, like a win-win-win, like you said earlier, that can hopefully in the future bring more democracy, bring more human rights to the area, and eventually bring peace to the Middle East.
Yeah. Well, I agree with that. So So yeah, thanks for coming on, Jaeger. And be sure, everybody, to like this video. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so yet. Check me out over on Twitch. The link is in the description below. If you'd like to financially support what I do here, you can check out my Patreon as well as my PayPal link in the description. And be sure to go and follow and subscribe. Well, follow Jaeger over on Twitter, as well as subscribe to Jaeger on YouTube at Jaeger DePedo. So with that, thank you for being here, everybody, and have a good night.